Genesis 22. I want to start at verse number 1. We're going to look at those first 14 verses. We're going to read all of them. I'll ask that you kind of follow along with me. I'll kind of fade out and you kind of pick up, and we'll go back and forth together until we get to the 14th verse. It is important that we look at this together as we get a clearer picture of Abraham's experience. If you've been hanging around the church for anything longer than a year, you've heard of Abraham. And if you've hung around longer than that, you've heard of his sacrifice, his commitments that he had to make with God. Just 10 chapters earlier in Genesis, we meet him. 10 chapters later, we see him having the supreme test of faith and confidence in God. And what is interesting as we look at the life of Abraham, there are many things that we can lift or glean from his life and his experience. I hope today that you are encouraged by what you will see, what you will read, and what you will hear. Let's look at chapter 22 of Genesis, starting at verse number 1. After these things, God tested Abraham, underline that, and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your what? Only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and rose and went to the place of which God had told him. And on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. Verse 6, and Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father, he said, here am I, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, underline this, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them, together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on the top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God. What? Your only son. Keep reading. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided. So we generally, when we read this passage, our focus is on Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. But today, ladies and gentlemen, I don't merely want us to focus on Jehovah Jireh. I want us to focus on Abraham, and I want us to look at what it takes to have an experience like he did with God. There are some things that you need to hear, and there are some things that you need to know, and there are some things that you need to declare personally, spiritually, that I will be taking this home with me and using it for the rest of my life. Abraham's story is not just one designed to evoke celebration and excitement because we hear the compound, complex phrase, Jehovah Jireh. We hear it and we get excited. And we hear it and get excited because God is providing. But what did it take for God to provide? And I would today argue to some wonderful people that God is going to provide, but it's going to cost you something. God is going to provide, but not before you have had an experience with him that tests your faith, that tests your commitment, and that tests your resolve. God will provide. Oh, yes, God will provide. But what happens when God provides, but sometimes you have to say, Lord, it cost me everything. God, thank you for what you've given me, but I had to go to the very end of my being to maintain who I am. Lord, thank you for providing, but Lord, I lost sleep over this one. Lord, thank you for providing, but I think I aged a few years in this trial. Let's look at Abraham's experience from a different perch. A couple of observations concerning the test from, of course, Abraham's test, but just in general, when I look in Scripture, I see some observations that we need to make. Here's the first one. God makes the test, we decide the difficulty. God makes the test, but we decide how hard it is. Listen to me carefully. Whatever you're going through is just a test. There is no attached difficulty to it until you attach one. So then, for some of us, what we would consider a light test or no test, other people will consider a life-altering test. God sends the test our way, but we decide the difficulty. Some of you in here today, the Lord has sent things your way, and because they were things that you loved, you could not part with them, so then that test for you became difficult. For somebody else, same test, they have no attachment to the thing, so as soon as God says, give that up, they say, no problem. God sends the test, you determine its difficulty. Here's the next one.